The progressive push against guns. I'm Brian Lilley with TheRebel.media. Across North America, there's a push by progressives, by people on the left, to try and make gun ownership more difficult. And it's happening on the local level. Why? Because whether it's Washington, D.C. or Ottawa, they've noticed that they're not having an awful lot of luck pushing through gun control measures at the federal level. So they're looking to local governments to do it. I want to play part of a report for you from KIRO out of Seattle, Washington, where they've just brought in a new tax on gun owners.
Each legally sold gun in the city of Seattle will now be subject to a new $25 tax. The city council voted unanimously this afternoon to tax guns and the ammunition they require.
All right, there's the basic parameters of it. $25 per gun, 2 to 5 cents per bullet, depending on the type of bullet. That's going to add up after a little bit of time. Little by little, gun ownership becomes more of a nuisance. And it doesn't matter if gun owners groups are lobbying Washington or Ottawa. This is happening at the local level, and it becomes like a game of whack-a-mole. It's more difficult to slap down everyone. Down the coast, down the left coast, from Seattle, in Los Angeles, they've come up with new gun storage restrictions. It's not about public safety. It's about making it more difficult to own firearms. And here in Canada, middle of an election, the New Democrats, the Socialists, they are promising that if elected, they will allow cities to ban handguns. It's already very difficult to get one, but they'll say, we want to allow cities to ban handguns. Doesn't matter that you have to go through a safety course, a background check, a police check, all of that doesn't matter. This is their world view. Now, progressives south of the border in the United States, they're always going to say, well, we've got to be just like Canada. I want to give you some stats right now that might be shocking to an awful lot of people. And I like to compare provinces and states that are side by side and look at their homicide rate. Let me start with Quebec, because Quebec is always viewed as the birthplace of the gun registry in Canada, a place that's very much in favor of gun control. It might be a myth, but that's the argument put forward. Now, what is the homicide rate in Quebec? Well, in 2012, it was 1.3. Guess what it was in neighboring Vermont? 1.3 per 100,000 people. Exactly the same. Now, in 2013, Quebec had a big drop. They went down to 0.83 after they saw a drop of 40 murders. They went from 108 murders in 2012 to 68 in 2013. Vermont, they had a huge spike. They went from 8 murders to 10. Now, why is it interesting to compare these cross-border areas? Quite often they have similar geographies, they have similar settlement patterns, and this is the argument the progressives make. So let's turn it back on them. So they normally have a homicide rate that's almost exactly the same, 1.3 per 100,000 in 2012. It was like that for several years until Quebec had their big drop. Nova Scotia, it's 1.8 in 2012, 1.38 in 2013. Neighboring Maine, 2 in 2012, 1.8 in 2013. Not a big difference. Skip across to the west, you go to Manitoba, 4.16 in 2012 compared to Minnesota's 1.8. In Manitoba in 2013, 3.87 per 100,000. Minnesota, 2.1. That's a huge difference. Remember, it is always easier to get a gun in the United States of America, regardless of state, than it is to get a gun in Canada. And yet you've got neighboring states to neighboring provinces with either similar or vastly different, in the wrong direction, according to the progressives, murder rate. Saskatchewan, 2.67 in 2012, 2.9 in neighboring Montana. In Saskatchewan in 2013, it was 2.71 to Montana's 2.2. So the arguments simply don't hold, not in the least. And yet, progressives are going to continue making them. They're going to continue saying this is the way forward. Well, it's time to look at the facts. Oh, my next guest doesn't really need any introduction if you've been following the issue of gun rights for any time. John Lott, he's the author of More Guns, Less Crime. You can also look up his website, crimeresearch.org. That's the Crime Prevention Resource Center. Correct, John?
Research Center, right.
All right. Spelled E-R, the American way, not R-crazy R-E?
Right.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I guess we're not international enough yet.
All right. Let me ask you about this. I was speaking earlier about, we've got these local attempts to control guns in Seattle with the tax on each each gun sold, whether it's a rifle, handgun, what have you, $25. You've got the per bullet tax. In Los Angeles, you've got safe storage regulations coming in. In Canada, you've got the New Democrats promising, hey, we'll let cities ban handguns, even though they're incredibly difficult to get. Is this the new method of trying to bring about gun control, since it seems that going to a national level, be it Congress or Parliament, just doesn't work?
Right. Well, obviously there are people who do want to ban guns, and they can't ban it directly, at least in the United States quite yet, though that may change if the Supreme Court changes. And so they go and try to do other things. The most direct thing that I think you see happening nationwide is just to impose taxes and fees, such as what you're seeing in Seattle on getting guns. Just last November, an initiative was passed in Washington State, which would add about $60, $65 on the cost of transferring a gun. So this $25 tax is on top of the $60, $65 that you just had last fall. It's just ratcheting it up one bit at a time to try to remove gun ownership.
All of a sudden, the $200 rifle you want to get for your son when he's old enough, or your daughter, that you want to get for your kid to say, hey, here's a plinker for the backyard, and it used to cost $150, $200. Now it's going to cost you closer to $300, and that starts to add up after a little while.
That's right. And more importantly, in a sense, is who is it freezing out of the market? It's basically poor minorities who live in high crime urban areas like Seattle. And the problem is that my research, if it convinces me of anything, is that it's people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime, these poor blacks who live in high crime areas, who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. And so I'll just give you one example. Back in 2013, when Colorado was passing its taxes and fees on people being able to obtain a gun, there was an attempt by the Republicans in the state assembly there to exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay that tax at the state level. And the problem is, with the exception of just two pro-gun Democrats, every single one of the Democrats in the state house voted against exempting people below the poverty level from paying that tax. I mean, how many taxes can you name where Democrats will vote virtually unanimously against exempting people below the poverty level? In Maryland, that same year, they passed licensing regulations that cost well over $300 to license and register a handgun now in Maryland. There was a similar attempt to exempt people below the poverty level there. But since the Democrats controlled 2/3 of the state house and the state senate, they refused to even allow a vote on exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay these high fees. So, it seems like Democrats will often claim that they care about helping out poor people. Obviously, the police, you look at a place like Baltimore, police weren't even allowed to go and protect people during some of those riots.
They were told to hold back. But let me ask you this. Will this prevent gun violence? Let's talk about the actual facts on the ground. What does your research say?
Well, who's going to pay the tax? Is it going to be the gang members who are going to pay the tax? No, it's going to affect law-abiding citizens who are going to obtain guns legally. They're the ones who are going to be paying, whether it was this $60, $65 fee last year or this additional $25 that we have now. And so it's raising the cost of law-abiding citizens relative to criminals getting guns. But as I say, to me, it seems racist in the sense that the people that they're most likely to affect aren't wealthy people in Seattle. It's basically going to be poor minorities, primarily poor people in general, but poor minorities who are going to be disproportionately affected by having all these taxes and fees that are there. And, the liberals in Seattle, which control the city council there, somebody needs to ask them why it is that this is the way they want to try to control guns.
Earlier on, I was pointing out that because liberals in the United States will always look to Canada and say, we need strong gun laws like Canada. And I know it's not your favorite comparison, but I said, well, look at the difference between Manitoba and Minnesota. They're right next to each other, similar climate, similar settlement patterns, all of that. And yet the murder rate in Manitoba is far higher And guns are much easier to get in Minnesota. And there's several instances, several examples of that I can show you across the Canada-U.S. border. So when liberals point north and say the United States has to be like Canada, it doesn't necessarily hold water, does it?
Well, it doesn't hold water when you look across countries around the world. If you look at all the countries around the world, the United States doesn't have a particularly high murder rate. We're well below the average.
Oh, what? Wait a minute. No, everyone gets killed with a gun in America. I read that somewhere. It's on the interwebs.
Well, I guess that doesn't happen to me till tomorrow, if everybody.
Okay.
But look, you can go to our website at crimeresearch.org, and there's a little tab there that says More Guns, Less Crime. If you click on that, it'll show all the data. It shows the sources from the data from the UN. And you can go and look at homicide rates across countries. And the United States isn't even that close to the mean there. And the thing is, if you look across countries, the countries that tend to have the lowest gun ownership rates tend to have the highest homicide rates. And that's true even when you break it down by developed countries using the OECD data. So, it's I know these things get talked about lots of times, but it's a caricature. People will pick a few countries like the UK, for example, and compare it to the United States. But even there, you were saying I somewhat disapproved of the comparison you were making. I understand the comparison because that's the type of comparison people make, and you're just giving it back to them the way they want to do it. Mm-hmm. My problem with that type of data is that you really aren't controlling for the differences across places. There's really a lot of reasons why crime rates can vary. And so people will say, look, the UK has relatively few guns, has relatively low homicide rate compared to the United States, so it must be the low gun ownership rate that's causing the low homicide.
Well, they used to have a lot more guns.
Right.
And exactly. They didn't have a high homicide rate.
That's exactly the point. That before, let's say, they banned handguns in 1997, they had an even lower homicide rate. Before they had their big gun control push in 56, they had an even lower homicide rate. And you see these increases after each of these strict gun control laws that they have. And the problem that you face, and it's basically gets back to your point about whether this will impact crime, is that who obeys these laws? If the laws primarily disarm law-abiding good citizens relative to criminals, you unfortunately make it relatively easier for the criminals to go and commit crime.
The first full year after Canada's gun registry was abolished, our homicide rate went down. Shootings in the city of Toronto, our largest city, went down. Stabbings, by the way, went up. According to the people that want gun control, we should have had blood in the streets due to gun violence. Instead, we had a significant jump in the number of stabbing deaths. So what about across the United States? I know that Chicago, D.C., they've had some of their strict gun laws knocked down. Has it resulted in gun rampages through the cities, worse than existed before? I don't know Washington, D.C. that well. I've been there several times, but I used to know Chicago quite well, and they've long had a gun problem. They've long had a homicide problem all throughout their strict gun control days.
Yeah, no, that's true. Look, Illinois, it's true they're being forced to issue permanent concealed handguns. They became the 50th state. But basically what you find is that the later states that were forced to go and allow people to be able to protect themselves have tried to do other things to undermine that. And in Illinois, it costs easily over $500 to go through the process to go and get a concealed handgun permit. If you compare it to neighboring Indiana, to go through the entire process is like $45. To go through the process in Pennsylvania, it's $19 to go through the entire process. Mm-hmm. And again, you're talking about Chicago. We know where the high crime rates are in Chicago. They're basically in the south side. They're in poor, heavily minority, heavily black areas there. A lot of gang violence that's there. And who in those areas of town can go and afford to pay an additional $500 over and above the cost of obtaining a gun to be able to get the licenses that they need to be able to go and carry? And that's not the only problem. You can't go and get the license within Chicago. You have to go and travel outside. It's 16 hours, so you have to go And there are all these rules that make it extremely difficult to carry your gun with you on public transportation. So who do they think that discriminates against? All these things make it difficult for the people who need protection the most to be able to go through the process to get it.
It's frustrating to listen to these stats come up again and again and again.
It's going to come up even more in this next year, and at least in the United States. Bloomberg, Soros, President Obama, through federal money, there's just going to be a tidal wave of these types of claims over the next year. I don't think we'll ever have seen so much. I mean, literally hundreds of millions of dollars have been put into putting together research. They've done things like have education camps, essentially, for journalists. Bloomberg's worked with the Columbia School of Journalism to go and bring in journalists from around the country to go and be lectured to by gun control advocates to explain to them how they're supposed to go and cover the gun.
And then at that point, it doesn't become about facts. It becomes about worldview, and their worldview is anti-gun.
Right.
So this is what I'm saying. It's frustrating to listen to these facts come up time and time and time again. And then you look at the push for all these nuisance regulations, which just make it more difficult for people to protect themselves or for people to be able to just buy a gun for the enjoyment of it, whether it's hunting, trap shooting, target shooting, whatever. It's just there is a worldview out there that says guns are always dangerous and should always be kept out of the hands of regular citizens.
Right.
John, we'll leave it there. Thanks for joining us again, and tell people again where they can find you and your research.
Thanks. At crimeresearch.org.
And I did go to that tab you told me, more guns, and I saw more guns, less crime, and you're right. United States well below the average for homicide rate. So check out the facts, get the facts. Crimeresearch.org. John Lott, thanks so much.
Great talking to you.
You